Funny that you even brought that up because yesterday I bought one again.
You didn't?
Yeah. Still like one of the best cameras that's been made, and it's still one of my favorites.
Hey, Lumix, this is free consulting right here.
I do have one thing. This is just an extra little thing that if for some reason Lumix is watching this, I doubt they might watch this, but
today we are sitting down with a fellow creator and friend of mine who I've been a huge fan of, Nigel, who is well known on YouTube for talking about filmmaking gear that doesn't break the bank. Now in today's episode, we're going to be diving into talking about two cameras that Lumix needs to come out with that aren't the flagship models. But without further ado, Nigel,
dude,
what's up,
Matt,
man?
How's it going, man?
I'm stoked to get you on the episode again. If you haven't checked out our episode already, we talked about the Lumix S9 when I was in Oregon a couple months ago.
Yeah, dude, I think this is the first time that I'm actually like on your show that's like you're not here, which is weird.
I think you were also the only person that's been on my show in a live format as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so maybe we'll have to do that again in the future, but kind of want to get into a couple topics. But before we get into that, these are the warm-up starter questions, which I don't think I asked you when the first time we were on the show, so I'll ask you in this time. How did you get into the Lumix ecosystem as a whole? And then I know you have a bunch of different Lumix cameras, so I'm really curious to hear that current camera setup.
I first got into it back when the GH3 was, starting to become popular. I was shooting on like Canon DSLRs before then, like the T2i, T3i 60D. And when the GH3 came out, the GH2 had already kind of had like this cult following because of that hack that people have been putting on it to get like really high bit rate out of the GH2. And I knew that the GH2 would have been cheaper, but when I started seeing footage of the GH3 come out, I was like, wow, this is like the same price as like a 60D essentially, but it just looks so much sharper and just way better than all the Canon stuff that was out. So I jumped ship, and I knew that I was going to be paying the price with like shallow depth of field and, like low light performance, but I went to Micro Four Thirds and I was just blown away by how crispy the GH3 looked, even in comparison to like everybody back then. Is like, if you were a filmmaker during the DSLR revolution, you wanted a 5D Mark III or a 5D Mark II. But if you looked at it, the GH3 was way more detailed than the 5D footage. So I kind of like, that was my first introduction to like the Micro Four Thirds Lumix system.
And that current camera setup, I know you have an S5 2X, but you've been playing around with the GH5 a bunch, huh?
Yeah, so it's weird because like my S5 2X is what I use for like paid work, and if I'm getting paid to do something, I'm going to use my S5 2X. But honestly, like I use this GH5 probably more for my YouTube channel than my S5 2X. I don't know. I still love the Micro Four Thirds format, and I mean, if you look at this like setup, like I can just get so much done with just the GH5 and a 12 to 35, and because I mean. So like the way that I got this GH5 was kind of crazy because it's like I got it on a Facebook Marketplace deal, and it came with so much stuff that I ended up selling the stuff that it came with, and it essentially made the GH5 free. So it's essentially like a free camera for me. So it's like I also don't feel bad about taking it out, throwing it in a bag, getting a little rough with it because it's essentially a free camera, which is nice. But yeah, I've been loving the GH5. This is like the second time that I bought it, I think, and it still mixes in with like my S5 II footage perfectly fine. So I think that it's still like one of the best cameras that's been made, and it's still one of my favorites.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting with like how new cameras and new camera technology that's coming out. Like you can shoot on the S5 II, the S5 IIX, S9, G9 Mark II, GH7, blah, blah, blah. All those cameras, and you can easily, as a beginner, for the most part, as long as it's properly lit or something, you can get a pleasing image out of those cameras with like pretty much like not a lot of skills. But I think it is fun kind of shooting on those more budget cameras and kind of forcing limitations to kind of get yourself more creative and making those things look good. So for example, the GH5, which that's still actually a stunning camera, but like going even further back, you've bought the GH3 how many times now? Have you counted this yet?
It's funny that you even brought that up because yesterday I bought one again.
You didn't?
Yeah. Dude, I found one on eBay for $150, and so I was like, I can't not buy it, you know what I mean? So
this is a pro tip to the audience. If you have a GH3 and you want to sell it, just make it $100. Nigel will probably buy it.
Yeah, and it's just like I'm probably gonna, use it and then, give it to a friend, or I'm probably gonna keep this GH3 just for nostalgia's sake, just because it's such a iconic camera in my mind. But yeah, I've probably had at least 7 or 8 GH3s throughout my filmmaking career.
What does your wife think about that every time you buy the GH3
I
again?
mean, like I just tell her that like it's a business investment.
At least it's not like, you're dropping like 1,500 on a camera. It's like $100.
Yeah, yeah, it's not like it's. I mean, I feel like the money that I've made off of my GH3 videos has probably paid for all the GH3s that I've bought. So,
There you go. Now, I
yeah.
am curious as we're talking about kind of those Lumix budget cameras before we get fully into the topic of today's episode. What are your top three currently budget cameras? And they can be for Lumix or just in general.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I did a video on my second channel recently where I did like a tier list of like, budget cameras under $1,000, and the majority of them were Lumix cameras. And I think that that's kind of what got me into Lumix in the first place, was not only that like the images that they created were way better than the competition, but it was also that they were a lot more budget friendly than the competition. And so I don't know, like usually when people ask me like, like, what's the best camera for under $1,000, sometimes I do send them to Sony if they are needing specific features like, autofocus and stuff like that. But a lot of the times I'm just like, well, if you can afford it, go for like the original S5. Or, I mean, like realistically, if you have $1,000 and you wanted to get your first camera, I've seen the S5 II go for like 12 or $1,300. So it's almost like buy an S5 II, like save up a couple hundred extra bucks, buy an S5 II, you'll be way happier than anything else in that price range. So I think that's like that would be my main suggestion, is try to get an S5 II if you can save up that money. If you're on a really, really tight budget and like you only have around $500, that's where I would suggest like a GH5. Obviously there's a lot of limitations that you're going to have to deal with, like no autofocus that's usable and low light isn't great. But as far as like the image that it creates, it can match with an S5 II very, very easily. So, and I just like I think people will typically be just as happy with like, working with a Vlog or a Vlog L profile as they will with like, S-Log or even any of like the F-Log or Z-Log from, Fuji or Nikon. So
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it is interesting though, because I did watch your tier list video talking about all the different cameras, and a lot of them are Lumix cameras. But one common theme I did notice on all of like the best cameras that are in the budget category from Lumix is that they're all used cameras. There's nothing new and there's nothing like brand new. And obviously used cameras are still great cameras, and like it's probably better for the waste of the population instead of just buying something new every single time. But it is interesting to see that like the used market so it's great if you want to get into the Lumix ecosystem, because the used market is great like for buying purchases, because they tend to be a lot lower than other camera companies. But it's also kind of the downsides, like, oh, you get into Lumix, it's if you want to sell that camera, you might not be getting your money back because of that used market. I am curious to hear your thoughts as we're slowly kind of getting into the topic, talking about these two cameras that Lumix needs to make, which is for the budget market. What do you think a good price point for a camera body and a kit lens in today's market for a budget camera should be?
I kind of feel like for most people, getting a camera and a lens, like a kit lens, around the $1,000 to $1,200 price point is kind of like the sweet spot. Obviously, there are people who are on a lot tighter of budgets, and I understand that, but I still feel like realistically, I mean, if we look at the new Fuji camera that came out, the XM5, that one I think came out at a starting price just for the body of like $800, which I think is a pretty good price range for like a beginner camera. Then you still have a couple extra $100 to, buy a kit lens or something like that. And I'm sure there's even, bundled kit lenses for that camera. So I kind of think that's where like Lumix still needs to figure out a camera to fit in that, like that price point, like the $800 for the body type of, price. And yeah, that is something that Lumix doesn't really offer right now. I know that like I've seen, Black Friday specials for the S9 for around $1,100 to $1,200, which is sick. but they still don't have anything that like its introductory price is around that $800 to $1,000 price range.
Right. I think anything that's under that like $1,000 price point is like the sweet spot for the budget market, because the moment you say something's over $1,000, especially to like say an 18-year-old who has, you know, a minimum wage job, which now in California you can actually make a lot of money, but they're not wanting to probably spend something over $800 for a camera, especially when, you know, their phone is $1,000 at that point. But it is interesting because I do think a lot of people had an issue with the Lumix S9 because everyone saw this camera kind of like as that intro camera. But I'm curious to hear your take on it after a few months has passed, the firmware updates out, on who you think this camera is actually for and not as this everyday carry for the average Joe that I feel like people think this camera's for.
Yeah, it's strange to think of the S9 as in the same price bracket now, at least if you look at, you know, used prices, as the S5 II, because objectively the S5 II is a better camera to get unless you want a smaller size. So I think the S9 could really be like, I honestly think that it would be a good camera for someone like me who just needs a small B cam now, because you don't have to worry about the record limit. I'm sure you can get, I don't think I've seen anyone do record times with like one of like those Ulanzi fans, but I know that that Anthony did your entire podcast like on the S9 for like, you know, like over an hour, and it didn't shut off on him, which is sick, because that was like one of the main things that I always think of, like, okay, if I did a podcast and I had a 2-camera setup, I wouldn't want one to die out. So now I feel like with the firmware update, it can actually be a pretty usable B cam. So I think that for people like us who just need an extra camera that's way smaller that we can throw in our bag and still use the same lenses, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it doesn't, at least at its introductory price, it was kind of a hard sell for the average consumer, I think.
Yeah, no, for sure. It was interesting because that podcast I did with Anthony was in 6K, 24 frames a second, vlog 10-bit. So it was a heavy Kodak as well. It wasn't like shooting 3.3K open gate, which I would love to see 3.3K with more frame rate options instead of just 30p.
Yeah.
But I do kind of see that S9 as like, if you've never shot on cameras before, I wouldn't recommend this specific camera for you as like your first camera, just because it is a little bit heavier in the features, but it's also kind of a little bit pricey for what things are missing for that price range. But if you are a filmmaker and photographer already and you're wanting that small camera, I feel like this is like the perfect dad camera for people who are filmmakers, if that makes sense. Like for myself personally, you know, pulling out like the S5 II to pulling out the S9, like that's just going to make a huge difference when I want to just take photos casually, like as I'm walking around town or going on a trip. That's where this one kind of comes into play. But kind of transitioning on, we're going to be kind of talking about 2 cameras that I think Lumix should be making. One is, both are going to be budget cameras. One's going to be for full frame, and then one is for the Micro Four Third cameras. Now, of course, I think to clarify, I don't think these should be the next camera Lumix comes out with. I think the S1H Mark II box camera and an S1 flagship needs to come out like as soon as possible. So I think that's a clarification. But the 2 cameras that we're going to be coming up with are going to be for a budget Micro Four Third camera and a budget full frame camera. Now, I'm curious, I kind of threw out names. I am curious to hear what name ideas, if you had any, what these cameras should be called before I say what I thought they should be called.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really, like, after you told me yours was like, that kind of makes sense. The only thing I can think of is like, I know that Lumix adds like they add a number sometimes to like their model numbers. So like instead of a S9 or something like that, it could be like an S95 or a, you know, whatever. That was my only thought, but I actually think that like if they were going to name it, I hope they name it what you came up with, because I think that sounds cooler.
Yeah, I think the first one for Micro Four Thirds is the G7 Mark II. And then I actually came up with a couple other options for a full frame version. Lumix, this is free consulting right here, is the S10, the SX5, or the SM5.
There you go.
three free options. Now,
Yeah.
I am curious before we get into the features, what would you say the price points are? Because what you said earlier about the budget of what a budget camera is will be very interesting because I said completely different price points to what you
Yeah.
probably have said.
Well, here's the thing. I think that with the Micro Four Thirds, it's a little bit easier, but with the full frame S series, it's kind of hard because the features that I would like to see in it, I feel like would make it better than the S9, at least in my opinion. And so if it's better than the S9, then it should probably cost more, but I don't want it to cost more than the S9 did initially, you know? So I think that like if the S series full frame one was around 1,000 to 1,200, that would make sense. But the Micro Four Thirds one, I definitely think needs to be in the $800 price range.
Yeah, interesting. So for myself, I personally was saying that like the G7 Mark II with the kit lens, because the 14 to 42 is pretty affordable. I think if it replaced the current G7 price at like $697 would be a killer deal. And then
Yeah.
for the, the full frame budget camera, I guess now with the logistically thinking about how much lenses cost, I originally said $897 just because I feel like that's a really solid price point. But that could also just be body only at that point. But it would be great to see if they were somehow able to make the camera so affordable where it's like if you wanted to get the body only, it would be around maybe $500. But then with that kit lens, it becomes that $897
Yeah.
range.
Yeah.
And it would be great. Yeah, the 18 to 40 or the 20 to 60 would be also solid kit options
Yeah.
for a camera at this budget. Now, I'm curious, what do you think camera companies' current budget price point is set at right now? Like for what they consider this is a budget price.
You know, I want to say that it's around like the $800 price range. Maybe I'm off on that, but like I'm just using the new Fuji camera as like kind of, like an example. Like that's kind of Fuji's entry level camera, it seems, even though it's got a lot of really cool features. It seems like it's like their entry level camera. Maybe I'm a little bit off. I think that Fuji also has like XT30, like really consumer cameras that are a little bit, cheaper than that. But yeah, I mean, I think around $600 to $800 is kind of like what I would expect to pay for like a pretty entry level camera at this point.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think thinking in the mindset of like, this is the market that Lumix is missing too. Like, obviously, I think the S5 II and the S5 IIX, the G9 Mark II and GH7 are also great examples of like, these are great intermediate cameras. And then eventually when the S1H or the S1 Mark II come out as the flagship full frame cameras, those are going to be great, like more advanced features. But both of those cameras require people to switch entire ecosystems. But that's kind of where these ideas come up of having a budget camera that can, bring people into the entire Lumix ecosystem. So
Yeah.
what are those specs, Nigel? Let's get down to the nitty gritty. What do you think should be in these cameras?
Okay, so do you want to hear my Micro Four Thirds or S? Because I only have like three things that I really would want from like the new. Well, I guess four from the new S small budget full frame camera.
Let's hear the full frame one.
Okay, so if we're talking like same type of body as the S9 or same style, like a smaller camera that's full frame and budget, I would definitely I would want it to have an EVF, and I know that that's what everybody wants. But I think that if they can do it in the GM5, which was a super old Micro Four Thirds camera, they should be able to do it in a full frame version. I think that there needs to be a left side HDMI port. I don't even care if it's full size, just a left side HDMI port. So if there are people that do want to rig it and put a monitor on, it's not going to be stuck on the right hand side. And it needs to have an external SD card slot, so not in the battery compartment. And then the only other thing that I would want is just no record limit. Same with the S9 now. Just don't put any restrictions on the record limit. Let us overheat our cameras if we want to, but just, make it known that it will overheat. Because I'm sure that, if we're talking budget S9 style small full frame camera, we're not talking about fans and, cooling systems. That's going to be reserved obviously for the bigger cameras. So those are the only three things that I would want. And then if it was still around like that budget price point. Maybe they could take some, some features away so that it differentiates a little bit from the S9, maybe some photography features that us filmmakers don't care about, to try to keep it at around, $1,000 to $1,200. That's what I would like.
No, for sure. I think the idea of potentially like in the S9 style, maybe with more of a handle, like what you said, the micro HDMI, headphone jack, the mic jack, everything being on the left side of the camera makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Even having a battery, even if it was in the GH5 style body, would be really good, I think, for this camera. But then also, maybe it doesn't have IBIS and it has electronic stabilization, so you can kind of save space in that camera to keep it a little bit more small. But I think what also, I wrote this down because I think it would be funny to have built-in flash.
Yeah.
I know it's cringy, but if you got to think about it, if someone's not spending a ton of money, I feel like they're going to be like, oh, this has a built-in flash. How cool is this?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, yeah, us actual photographers and filmmakers are like, yeah, we don't want that. But
Yeah.
I do think for that. Now I'm curious before we get into the video specs, because for myself, all the video specs are almost the exact same for both these cameras. I don't know if you did something similar.
Yeah, I mean, I have like pipe dreams, but I know that like it's kind of hard to expect in like a budget end camera, but
Right, yeah. Well, how would you see that G7 Mark II camera then?
Okay, so the G7 Mark II, I think it needs to be better than the G85, but it needs to be everything that was good about the G85 still, right? But just better than the G85. So I like the thing that I would expect from it as like a budget-friendly Micro Four Thirds camera would be to have 10-bit H.265 codec. It doesn't even need to be 422, just like 10-bit 420, H.265, super easy codec to shoot in and to edit. And then it needs to have, Vlog L. That's what I would expect on like an upgrade to a G85. And then I would expect open gate, kind of like how the S9 has open gate, and no cropping in 4K, which the G7 and the G85 do. When you shoot in 4K, there's an additional crop. And then just keep the body small, same size as the G7, the G85. Don't make it like G9 or GH5 size. I think that's like the allure too of those, like the Micro Four Thirds system is to have like a nice small body with, still a really nice ergonomic grip. Those are the features that I would expect. Obviously, it'd be nice to have, 4K 60 with no crop, but then you could be getting more into like the G9 Mark II, GH7 kind of territory. But if I was just hoping for like an entry-level camera that I could start recommending to people who are just getting in to filmmaking, it would be with those features, and then like obviously having good autofocus as well, because then I think that it could just sweep the floor with cameras like the ZV-E10 Mark II. Sure, it's going to be Micro Four Thirds, but like having all those features along with the IBIS and everything like that, I think that that's what the G7 Mark II or the upgrade to the G85 would need to be.
Yeah, and I think I'm in the same boat. I think like 10-bit 4K 24 30 frames a second, 10-bit 1080 60 frames a second, no crops on any of that, all just 420 long op, and then with the Vlog L is like all things that I said, and then obviously face detect autofocus I think is a must in all of these cameras, so people can just expect really good autofocus from an entry level camera, and then when they move on up, it's the same type of autofocus, and it's just much better features. I would be curious to see if they would pit open gate. I feel like cameras in this market, I didn't pit open gate because I'm like, I don't feel like people are going to be like thinking.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking like the 3.3 open gate, that you see in
Right,
like
yeah,
the S9.
yeah.
Maybe not 6K or anything like that, but just like some open gate, so that like if people, because like honestly, I know that there's a lot of people that shoot in anamorphic, but I've been seeing so many people just shoot. I mean, like I do it too, just shooting in the 4:3 format, and just using the entire sensor just as like an aesthetic choice. So I think that could be like a cool little feature that you could especially, sell on like the younger filmmakers coming up who are starting to see that in a lot of their favorite creators and can be like, oh, I can do the same thing. I don't have to put these, 4:3 crop bars on my video. I can just shoot in 4:3.
I think, yeah, what you're saying, having a 3.3K, like the MP4 Lite definitely makes a lot more sense. At least, hopefully, in my mind, a 30 frames and a 24 frames a second would be nice. I can see that being more specifically only 30 frames a second. I could personally see on both these cameras a 30-minute record limit with the functionality of turning off the limit, so it can't be like our cameras overheat and break, so it can't be Lumix's fault. Like they're like, we put a record limit, you turned it off. So I do see that, but then something else I think that makes perfect sense and that would just help the entire ecosystem as a whole is the Lumix Lab app functionality and real-time LUTs. I think if they're able to figure out how to make that also just be as simplified as possible and make people just get so used to that Lumix Lab app functionality and keep supporting that app in its entirety and figuring out the real-time LUT workflow, I think that will make more people just gravitate towards those budget cameras, be like, oh wow, there's like this app, I'm able to like download creators' LUTs, put it on, take photos, do videos, and like I think that just opens the door and makes this entire kind of workflow process and like transition process to the higher end cameras over time, like much easier. I'm curious to hear if you have any other thoughts on these cameras.
I mean, I don't have like, there isn't really much more that I could probably like want. I mean, I really do think that like it's what you're saying, that like Lumix has a lot of like high-end cameras right now, at least, especially in the Micro Four Thirds, like their Micro Four Thirds lineup. Like the G9 Mark II is like the photographer slash does a little bit of video, camera. The GH7 is their, filmmaker's camera, but there isn't currently anything that people can upgrade to those cameras from, at least like not any like new camera from Lumix. So I definitely think that like it makes sense for them to make an entry-level camera that can get people back into the Lumix system, either in full frame or Micro Four Thirds. I do have like other wishes that are like not necessarily camera like wish list items. If you'd like to hear some of my lens and
sure, let's do it. Are these just like firmware updates or what are these?
No, these are physical products, and it's mostly just lenses, and there's one thing that isn't a lens. But I just, in the Micro Four Thirds like realm, I kind of wish. Did you ever use the Lumix 7-14 like wide angle lens?
I've not used that, but I have used the 10-25.
Yeah, so like the 10-25 is great. It's like their Leica, f1.7, but I think that the 7-14, that's like their wide angle. I think that needs to be remade and made better, because that's not a rectilinear lens, I don't think, or maybe it is, but you can't put filters on it. So it's just kind of like, it's got like the bubble on it. And so I think that lens needs to be remade so that people who are just trying to buy like the 3-lens trio, the wide zoom, the mid zoom, and the telephoto zoom can have something that is up to date, like something that's a little more in line with like this 12-35 style, but with the 7-14. I don't even care if it's the same aperture, which I think the 7-14 was like f4 constant maybe. I just think that kind of needs a remake because it's kind of long in the tooth. And then it would be really nice to get an 8-16 that's just a little bit faster, because I think that their 8-6 or their 8-18 is like f4 to 5.6 or something like that. So it's kind of slow. So I know that's a lot to ask because they already have the 10-25, which is kind of close, but I think that if they have like a remake of that Leica 8-18, just make it a little bit faster. I'd sacrifice on the long end and just make it like an 8-15 or an 8-16 and just have it a little bit faster, like f2.8 or something like that, constant, like the the 2.8s are with the 12-35 and 35-100. So I think those two lenses on the Micro Four Thirds like realm are ones that I would like to see. And then in the full frame, I still think that even though that new like pancake zoom came out for full frame, I still think we need actual pancake lenses. And I think that if Lumix doesn't do it, companies like Samyang are going to end up making like actual pancake lenses for the L mount. So
now I'm curious, have you seen the new Samyang lens for the E mount that are pancake?
Yeah, like they've had they've had like smaller pancake lenses for E-mount for a while now, I think, right?
But this is really cool. So it's I don't have the 826 mil on me, but I don't even know where that lens is actually. But it's a pancake lens. It's for Sony E-mount, but I'm hoping they're able to figure out how to make it for L mounts. But it's basically a pancake lens that you can. It takes a magnetic part. It's f2.8. You take out the lens part and you hit on a different lens. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
21, 28, and 32 mil. But it's all f2.8. You have full aperture control.
Yeah.
I don't think the focal lengths are that great. I think they have to be close for that specific reason. But I think
Yeah.
doing something like that would be hands down amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, like even if Samyang just came out with their original pancakes that they have for Sony E-mount, but just made them for L-mount, like I'm pretty sure they had like 24, 35, and maybe a 50. I'm not 100% sure, but we've already seen that Samyang is making lenses for L-mount. I tested out the 35 to 150 f2 to f2.8, so we know that they're making them for L-mount. But I just wish they would make. I mean, I wish somebody would make actual pancake lenses for the L mount, because then, you know, you could justify buying a camera like the S9 a lot more, because you could just, you know, buy yourself a nice little strap, get yourself the S9 with a pancake lens, and then just go out on the town, you know, with a nice fast prime that you can take some nice portraits or, you know, street photography with, I guess.
Yeah, and I do think like the 18 to, so I have it right here showing my audience, but I do think like this lens right here, the 18 to 40, I think could have filled that gap for a lot of people, but it is a little bit of that bamboozled that Dustin said today in his video, where it's like you would think that this is the 18 mil, and then when you zoom out, that's the 40 mil and you're done. But unfortunately, this is where the 18 mil starts, and then it doesn't really change the distance or like from the lens, but that's the 40 mil. But it would have been great if this was 40 and that was 18. And I think that's what a lot of people expected. But the only downside is just the variable aperture with this. And that's like where pancake prime lenses would really come in clutch, to have like an f2.8 pancake small lens that's like half this size, and you have full aperture. Oh my gosh. Aperture. I'm done. That word's not happening today. Apertoire. That is just not happening today. I have one more question for you, Nigel. Well, sort of a two-part question. But before that, where can people check out your channel?
Yeah, so you can just find me at my name, which is Nigel Barros. That's Barros on YouTube. And then same thing on Instagram and Threads. And yeah, you can also check out my website, which is nigelbarros.com.
So the last kind of one big question, but it's kind of a two-parter. I am curious to hear how you got into making camera budget videos here on YouTube. And I know you have the Nigel Barros 2, which has kind of been a little bit more experimental and a little bit more fun, I think, for yourself. But I'm curious to hear, what do you want to start doing more with your own current channel, and what can we expect from the main YouTube channel?
I think I got into the whole budget thing just because, like, for the first start of my filmmaking career, I was, on a budget. Like, I couldn't just like spend thousands and thousands of dollars on my filmmaking equipment. And, because I've been making videos since I was 14, and when you're a 14-year-old, you have no money. So like, I've always kind of been in this, what's the max squeeze? Like, what's the most amount of quality I can get for the least amount of money? And so I think that started to resonate with a lot of people, because, there's a lot of people that are like also on, tight budgets when they're first starting out in filmmaking. But then as I got, more into it, I started finding that like, it's actually like, there's like a big market, or like a big audience for people who are just like trying to figure out what's the cheapest camera with the best quality. And so that's kind of how I like got into the whole budget filmmaking space. During COVID, with my GH3 lighting tutorial that kind of blew up my channel. That's kind of like, I kind of rode that wave for a while. I found that with my main channel though, as I've grown as a filmmaker, talking about budget stuff and doing very basic tutorials is just not as fun anymore. And so for a lot of like my tutorial review stuff, I'm almost trying to like transition that more to my second channel, which my second channel is just kind of like, it's the, very bare minimum effort, I feel, as far as like, video goes. So I just kind of like, I throw stuff up there and I don't care at all if it does well or not. And my main channel, I really want to start transitioning to like stuff that I'm a little bit more stoked to make, like, short documentaries, short films, spec ads, that type of stuff. But I also still like, I like talking about gear. And so if I can like merge that on my main channel where it's like, I make these pieces that I'm really proud of, but also figure out how to talk about gear at the same time. That's kind of what I want to like, I guess, have my main channel for. And then my second channel can just be, me throwing my camera up, talking about camera profiles and cheap drones and, ranting about stuff and doing tier lists and stuff like that. So that's kind of what my main channel is for. And it's been really fun and kind of freeing to have that second channel. Or sorry, that's what my second channel is for. And it's been really fun and freeing to have that second channel to just, kind of be a little bit less stressed out about views and comments and all that type of stuff. I can just throw stuff up there and still feel like I'm getting stuff done because I'm still creating. It's just not for my main channel.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me on today's episode, Nigel.
Yeah. I do have one thing. This is just an extra little thing that if for some reason Lumix is watching this, I doubt they might watch this, but I think that one extra thing that I think that they could make for the S5 IIX, the GH7, whatever, is a relocating cable for their XLR unit, so that when you're rigging up your camera, you can relocate that XLR unit to somewhere else on your rig so that it's not right on top of your camera. That's another thing that I think is just on my wish list for stuff that I hope to see in the future.
have heard, I haven't tested this out, but there's a cable from Canon that is the exact same hot shoe mount. So you can plug into the hot shoe and then run that cable.
Yeah.
But I haven't tested it, so I can't.
There was one that was made by Landpart, which people were using for the GH5 and the older XLR unit, but it was so buggy and it didn't work that well. So it'd be nice to see Lumix just make their own that just works perfectly, because I think it'd be cool to like relocate that onto like a part of your handle, kind of like how the Sonys do, like put it someplace here. But
no, for sure. 100% agree. Well, anyways, thank you for joining me on today's episode. If you guys are curious to see another episode about Jason Morse switching potentially to Lumix, you can check out that episode right there. YouTube recommends you might like this episode right here. Till next one, guys. Peace.
Dude, you got those outros on lock.
So many people said that to me.